Hello, good morning. How are you?
Well, I'm very well. As it turns out, we should refer to my podcast today as Marks on Location because I'm not at home,
Okay.
Tim. As you'll see, my background for the third time in 3 weeks has changed. I've been moving about.
Okay.
So I find myself in Dahlstrom,
Okay.
and
Right.
it's been cold. And one thing you got to say about driving in the country of our country, we have got a beautiful place to live in. Eh? When you look
No,
around
that's
and
perfect.
you lighten up, look around, lighten up. It's not all bad news. Good morning. Now,
Okay, so I want to embarrass you this morning, which is what I
have a go. Tim,
enjoy doing
many
most
have
in life.
tried and many have failed. Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to do
Yeah.
this by starting off with a joke.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tim. I
Okay,
can't
so
wait.
you know
Yeah.
what Joan Rivers said about divorce or about marriage? You know, she's
Uh,
an American comedian, talk show
I
host, right?
do as it so happens. Yeah. She said something
Okay,
along the lines
so
that
she
about half
said,
of the people that get married, yeah.
yeah, that's exactly the one. The half of marriages end in divorce, and then there are the really unhappy ones.
Yeah. There's a line in my favorite song of all time by Pink Floyd. There's a line there which says, which is "Wish You Were Here," which says, "Did you
Right.
exchange a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage?"
Okay.
That kind of sums it up.
That's very deep. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So obviously the
Okay,
reason I wanted to talk
embarrass,
about
go.
marriage was because of the GNU,
Oh
which is
goodness
this
me.
the oddest kind of marriage. In some ways it's very odd. In some ways it's very ordinary because both sides seem to be saying, as my colleague Rob Rose mentioned in his newsletter this morning, both seem to be saying, I'm not getting divorced. If you want a divorce, you have to divorce me.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that the divorce is not about the money because that seems to be
Right.
disproportionately shared already. Okay, so we don't have to worry about the money. Okay,
Well, only
listen,
in a sense, but we'll get to that.
yeah, listen, this is the real, downside of this GNU spat, and I can't give it any more illustrious description than that. Is that the parties are fighting with each other. They're not
Right.
fighting for the good of South Africa. And so this has degenerated into a series of tit for tat spats. How's that for a bit of
Right.
poetry early in the morning? And we're going
Uh-huh.
into the budget vote approvals week, and they're going to I won't approve your budget if you don't approve mine.
Yes.
Embarrass me, Tim, if I haven't done
Well,
so
no, no, no. I'm
myself.
just no, no, no. I mean, it's just you're so much of more of an expert on the kind of marriage situation than I am. This is it's sort of developing into a kind of marriage where the parties absolutely hate each other, but they know that the only situation worse than the situation that they're in is the divorce situation where they have to get married to other parties.
Yeah,
So neither of them wants to stay in the marriage, and neither of them wants to get out.
yeah.
And that's I don't know what you think of that as a sort of political situation. Apart from the fact that it's not in the country's best interests, or people are not acting in the country's best interests. But I want to say one thing about both parties, and that is that the ANC seems to me, it just really hasn't accepted the fact that it's no longer the majority party. And the DA has not accepted the fact that it is a long way from being the largest party. Both of them
Yeah.
don't want to accept the fundamental truth about their current situation, which is perhaps
Yeah.
inevitable.
No,
What
I
do you
mean,
think?
well, let's not trade with the benefit of hindsight. But the minute that the DA handed the presidency to the president,
Right.
with all of the executive authority, it turns out that he does have. They'd sort of submitted to a marriage somewhat unwillingly, but of necessity. And the country would argue, and I'd agree with him, that it was a better result than it could have been. Okay, so now
Right.
you're in this dictated marriage, not of your making, not based on love. Now, in my experience, marriage is like the intersection of two independent circles. You need as small as possible and as strong as possible an intersection, and
Right.
as much free space to be who you are within that combination. And so most people either over intersect, so one circle overtakes the other, which is a submissive marriage, or they don't intersect at all, which is a why did we bother marriage? Okay. And
Right.
so, and then the consequence of the marriage, or sometimes the cause of it, is the arrival of children, which are a joint responsibility. So that's exactly
Right.
what we've got. We've got a marriage that is there because of joint responsibility, not because of common purpose. There's a
Yes.
vast difference between those two drivers of relationships.
Yeah, yeah. What I think is so typical of the marriage analogy is that it's the trivial things that seem to be, bounce out to become the most important. I mean, the latest spat between the DA and the ANC is about the axing of Andrew Woodfield as the Deputy Minister
Yeah.
of Trade and Industry. President Ramaphosa has explained why he did it, and the reason he did it was because he said that people weren't allowed to go to America, and then Andrew Woodfield did, and then there's a dispute about whether or not he asked and whether or not his apology was really an apology. But I do think the DA has a very good point in saying that this is kind of trivial compared to some of the other happenings within the ANC side of the agenda. And there are ANC ministers who have done much worse in this current term and haven't
No,
been
but
booted.
you know,
Um,
let
is
me
that
let
right,
me
or was that too much?
I'd say two things. First of all, there's no question in my view that the president doth protest too much. Okay, in
Right.
his explanation of the travel, what indiscretion I might call it at best, and I don't know all the facts. Okay, A, B, if the recourse is to fire some ANC ministers, then we kind of missed the point here. Okay, it's not.
Right.
That's not the point. The point is to get the matter rectified. Was it right? Was it wrong? Should we change it? Should we shouldn't? But you can't say. I tell you what, two wrongs make a right, or two rights make a right, or two. The focus is on relative punishment, not on absolute
Right.
truth. And I'm afraid neither party has endowed themselves with earnest and trust and I'm really surprised about it, and
Right.
I've really run out of things to say about it, Tim, because it's like it's like it really is to be blunt, it's a bit childish, man.
Yeah,
It is a bit
but you know
childish
what?
to.
I agree with you on that. But also, in a sort of curious way, I'm glad that it's holding together, even in this uncomfortable format.
Yeah, if you can, yeah.
I think they should continue arguing this point because my hope is that eventually they'll realize that actually it's about the kids. It's
Yeah,
about us. It's about the country.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
and that.
Agreed. Yeah.
Um, and that's in some ways that's the hope of all marriages. That eventually you reconsolidate over what is the really important part of your life. Anyway,
Whether this is true or
that
not,
is my view, and I have no. I mean, I am married, but uh, um, I'm not an expert on the topic.
yeah,
As
you can't say
uh,
"but" midway through a sentence because it disqualifies the words before
the
the
first
word
part of the
"but."
sentence,
Okay,
right?
that's one thing you learn in marriage. You go, listen. I think everything's
Okay.
okay, but then you only listen to the second half after that. Okay, because this much I do know. I don't know whether this is not true or not, but Warren Buffett, the king of long-term relationships, if you will, in the investment
Yes.
markets, is quoted as saying that when he was asked about, well, in long term relation, what is your view on marriage? What makes
Right.
marriage work? And he said, well, it's not
Right.
intelligence, it's not beauty, it's not the sex, it's not. He said, there's one simple rule: lower your expectations. Okay,
Yeah, it is.
okay, and at once that is funny but deeply meaningful. If you end
Yeah,
up in
that's
a
right.
in a marriage where you don't expect anything of each other, but you enjoy the person in their own way that you found and fell in love with, then you've got half a
Right.
chance. But I don't think we ever fell in love here. It was a marriage per force of circumstance, and that's harder and harder. And I don't
That's
think
true.
we'll ever
Yeah.
have peace until such time as we find a new love, until we have elections, until we can control an alternate elite, and at some point draw some lines behind this state of Non-agreement is the best I describe it. Tim, we've given it enough
All right.
air, man.
Can we?
You know
Can
what?
we?
Talking
Can I?
about
While we're talking about Buffett, can I mention a different topic, and that is
yes.
investment. You know what's really strange? You know more about this than me, but I think that there are really fundamental
You
changes
know how
taking
much
place.
trouble I get into with that statement. You know how many people have phoned me up and said, "You know what, Mark? Tim always starts a little thing with saying you know more than he does," and I sort of accept that gracefully. And then they say to him, "I'm not sure you do, Mark. I'm not sure. So can you stop putting me into that box?" All right. Yeah.
All right.
I don't know more
I
than you
know a
do.
lot about this. Not really.
Yeah,
But
there we
here
go.
goes.
You
Here
could be
goes.
the accused for a change. Yeah. Yeah.
The prevailing thought, the prevailing wisdom for the past 3 years, I would guess, is that the way to make money on the stock markets in the world is to invest in American equities. You can tell that, and you know what I'll do is for our YouTube watchers, I'll put some of these graphs up on the screen. And by the way, if you're listening to us on an audio system, you can also watch us on YouTube. But anyway, here goes. So the situation is over a 5-year span. So I'm just comparing two things, right? And this is the S&P 500 versus the MSCI Independent Emerging Markets, right?
Right.
So emerging markets over a 5-year span are up about 20%. The S&P 500 over a 5-year span is up over 90%. That is just incredible.
Are you measuring both in dollars? Are you measuring both in dollars?
Yes, yeah, measuring both in dollars.
Okay.
But here's the interesting part. Over 6 months, the S&P 500 is now up 5%. And the MSCI is up over 15%. Something has changed in the nature of the world that I think is quite significant. Emerging markets have rediscovered their Vuma. China has discovered, has a new kind of lease of life, which is completely contrary to what you would, sort of read about in the sort of Western press. And, also there are big currency changes taking place because the dollar has lost around about 10% of its value over this kind of short-term period, and it hasn't regained it. So is that significant, or am I just imagining a big change?
No,
Are
I'm
emerging
inclined.
markets back on the up?
I'm inclined to at first want to believe you, but I mean maybe this, this is the post-Zuma Vuma,
Right.
or is it the post-Trump bump? I mean, I'm full of poets this morning. Anyway, so
I know it's just it's beautiful.
I do think that that's the cover story, but maybe not
Right.
the underlying current. So the cover story says. There's reason why, particularly you mentioned China. I don't think China's strategy has moved away from their long-term strategy, which is to engage with the bigger and bigger piece of the world's markets. Okay, and so I think that China might have rushed in where America's rushed out and seen an opportunity for growth much higher than the one that they were battling about east-west. So I think
Right.
I think Africa, if you look at it in terms of population and things of that nature, I wrote about this. I think we might be near the bottom for all of us, disregarded emerging markets. There is it's worthwhile planting here, whilst it
Right.
might be worthwhile harvesting there. And so but I also have to say, Tim, 6 months is a hell of a short time, to make a judgment call about whether this is a turning point or a bump or a this or that.
Yes.
I've never been a good trader, but I think investors see, and I'm inclined to your view. I think the neglected cousins are going to be given a chance to bet. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yes. Yeah.
That would be us. That would be us,
All right.
Tim. Us neglected oaks down
That
here.
would be
in the
us.
south.
Yes,
That would be us.
Just
I hope
being
so,
slightly cautious about our priors, but apart from that. All right. What else do you need? Do you think needs examination this week?
Talking about going into bat, did you see this young Pretorius guy of ours, who's 19 nogal? That's not old, eh?
Right.
He's 19. When last I looked, I don't know I think he might have not even gone out. He was at 153, which is a pretty cool maiden innings for a 19-year-old batsman. Okay, given it's against Zimbabwe, but nonetheless, I find cricket a strange game because it's kind of like one miss and you're gone, mate. It's hard. It's
Right.
you can
Yes. Yeah.
drop a
Yeah.
pass in rugby and you're still
Brutal.
playing, but if you drop anyway, so that's good. Yeah, but someone sent me a picture depicting the satellites above the Earth. Okay, and it started off pretty much the year I was born, which was quite a long time ago. There was one. Okay, and so this
Right.
thing slowly increased, and the depiction of this graphically is these little yellow dots circling the Earth, and that has grown to something in excess of 15,000 satellites now, and they almost form a satellite cloud above the world. Okay, someone actually, a
Right.
friend of mine, remarked that maybe that's giving us protection against the ozone layer. That's how many bloody satellites are out there. What impresses me most is how coordinated that must all be at some level. I can remember in the good old days of radio. Okay, and
Right.
when you had sort of hack radios, when you tuned in, the amount of times you crossed into each other's frequencies and did all of this kind of thing, and that was simple radio, line of
Right.
sight radio. And how do they manage all of this, Tim? How does your little ping find its way to your little satellite, find its way back to the other
Right.
person receiving it without a hell of a lot of interruption? Are you familiar with all this technology? Because to quote you, you probably know more about this than me. There you are.
I mean,
Now you know how
you know
it
what I
feels.
think is
Yeah.
okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, under pressure to say something
Yeah. Yeah.
insightful,
You
I'm
better
going
be
to say the
smart now.
obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because the obvious is always the best starting point. I mean, I don't really understand it, but I'm fascinated by it, and I do think it is, you know,
Are you going back to marriage now?
extremely. Yeah, yes. I mean, it is extremely significant. The obvious utility of it derives from the fact that you are using the nature of planetary motion as your fuel. Because as soon as you reach orbiting speed, you're in the nature of the planetary systems, right? That's what
Yes,
orbiting
Tim.
means. Um,
I've never been more
so
impressed with any of your answers up to now. I mean, this should be, someone's going to write this down for posterity. Yeah, carry on. No, go, have a go.
You say there's a lot out there. Oh, there's not. Because you forget this is not only the surface of the Earth. This is something like the surface of the Earth times three, because we are talking about bodies that are circling the Earth on a wider radius, right? On a much wider
Yeah.
radius at different levels. So the innovation of Elon Musk's satellite system is that they are low orbiting. And because they are low orbiting, there's not very much lag between what happens on
Yeah.
Earth and the beam that you shoot up to the satellite.
Yeah.
But what I think is so interesting about this is that his satellites, even though Elon Musk, or Starlink, has more satellites almost than every other nation put together,
Yeah.
the thing is still running at now maximum. Now they've closed off
And
new
what? Oh, oh.
sign-ons to some parts of the African network because there's simply not enough bandwidth. And they are shooting up
There are two
5 rockets
causes
a
of
week
that.
now. It's incredible.
There,
It's just incredible.
there are two causes. There are two causes of that. First of all, the population's growing at, I don't know where we are
Right.
now, but 8 billion, call it. And second of all, the use of that technology is becoming wider and wider spread and accessible, and the unit cost of usage is tending towards zero, I guess. And that's a good thing in a way, because it does level the playing field of access to information in a funny way. And the only thing that seems
Yeah.
to dictate access to technology is politics rather than technology.
Yes.
Okay, and so, for
Yes.
example, we don't have Starlink now. That's got nothing to do with technology. That's a political issue, and I'm sure we'll get it in due course. I hope so. But technology is at once a liberator and a prison. I'm sorry, it just is. If
Yes.
I sit
That's also pretty deep,
and
Mark, I have to say, just
hey,
in
but
passing.
I read it somewhere. I know much more about these things than you do, Tim. Okay, much more, much more.
Okay.
No, but it is,
Yes.
I mean, it is in the sense that you sit in a restaurant and you watch
Right.
adults and children alike eating together while they look at a separate thing called a cell phone, or you watch children of whatever age, almost fresh
Yes.
out of their cots on an iPad playing a game. And I'm sorry, that's damaging. That's a route towards their brain and their habits and their mindsets, which is driven by adults, not by children. So this technology, I think, is a huge opportunity if we use it. It's like advanced medicine. It can cure you,
Right.
but enough of it can kill you. Yeah.
Yes.
How deep am I getting, Tim? I mean, hello, have a
No, I
nice
know.
day.
I know. It's
I know.
shocking. It's Monday. It's Monday.
Yeah, it's only Monday, for God's sake. I see that we have
Oh,
a new player in the fintech space. I see, hey, what's it? Lusaka, or what's it called? Lusako, acquired
right.
Bank Zero. I'd never
Yes.
heard
No,
of the
it's
first
amazing.
before, but I can
I
tell
know.
you
Yeah.
that Michael Jordan's a smart guy, so this is something that should be on our radar. I don't understand it, but old-fashioned banking, if I can call it that, better
Right.
watch out. That's all I'm saying. I'm
Yes.
not saying
No,
that
no.
it's Bank Zero or Capitec or whatever, but I'm telling you that the good old days of banking are over.
Yes. All right. Well, on that note,
On
let
that
us
positive
depart
note,
into the
yeah,
week. Mark, thank you very much. Thanks to the
yeah,
listeners for listening to us. Please do respond on whatever
yeah,
platform that you happen to be on, and please tell your friends about us and subscribe and do all of those good things.
yeah.
And
And
have a
we're
good
into
week.
the second half of the year. We're into the second
Yeah.
half of the year already. Have a great week, people.
Incredible.
Cheers now.
Cheers. Cheers. Bye.